On the evening of 1st July 1944, a tired voice crackled over a telephone line between occupied Paris and East Prussia. For nearly a month, the Allied invasion of Normandy had thrown the German high command into confusion. Reports of American soldiers pouring through the hedgerows around Carentan, of British and Canadian forces battering toward Caen, of the Allies seizing the deep-water port of Cherbourg, piled up on the desk of Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of Hitler's Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. When Keitel phoned his senior field marshal, Gerd von Rundstedt, the man who had been tasked with defending Western Europe since 1942, his voice betrayed the worry of a courtier who must relay bad news to an erratic sovereign. "What should we do?" Keitel asked. Von Rundstedt didn't waver. After half a century in uniform, a dozen campaigns, and 3 different governments, the old Prussian knew when a war was lost. "Make peace, you fools! What else can you do?" He snapped. It was a moment of blistering honesty that pierced the comfortable illusions of the Nazi leadership. It also cost him his command. The story of that phone call is more than a military anecdote. It is a window into how organizations collapse when truth is unwelcome. Over the next 10 months, millions would die, cities would burn, and Germany would be dismembered, outcomes that could not be prevented by wishful thinking. To understand why von Rundstedt spoke as he did, and why his honesty was punished, we must trace his journey from a young cadet in Imperial Germany to an unwilling servant of Hitler's empire. We must examine the strategic crisis that followed D-Day, the clash of doctrines between von Rundstedt and Erwin Rommel, and the failure of German command structures when political loyalty trumped military judgment. And, finally, we must consider what lessons this episode offers for leaders in any field. What happens when those at the top ignore the warnings of those on the ground? How do organizations behave when speaking the truth becomes a punishable offense? Von Rundstedt's story provides answers. Karl Rudolf Gerd von Rundstedt was born on 12 December 1875 in the town of Aschersleben in Prussian Saxony. His family belonged to the Junker aristocracy, a class of land-owning Prussians whose sons were expected to serve in the army. Von Rundstedt's father was a general. His brother was a major. There was never any doubt about the profession he would pursue. He entered military schools while still a boy and joined the Prussian army in 1891. By the time he was 16, he was already a cadet, and at 17, he received his commission. Military life, with its emphasis on duty, discipline, and hierarchy, was as natural to him as breathing. Von Rundstedt rose through the officer corps not by flashy heroics, but through competence. During the First World War, he served on staff positions on both the Western and Eastern fronts, learning the vital arts of logistics, coordination, and the management of large formations. When the war ended in defeat and revolution swept Germany, he remained in the drastically downsized Reichswehr, the professional army allowed by the Treaty of Versailles. Promotions followed steadily: lieutenant colonel in 1920, colonel in 1923, major general in 1927, lieutenant general in 1929. By 1932, he commanded the 3rd Infantry Division and supported Reich Chancellor Franz von Pappen's Prussian coup, demonstrating the political loyalty expected of a senior officer. When Adolf Hitler took power in 1933, von Rundstedt was already a pillar of the old military establishment. He did not join the Nazi Party and privately referred to Hitler as the Bohemian Corporal, but his sense of duty to the state outweighed any ideological reservations. In 1938, after the Gestapo fabricated charges against Colonel General Werner von Fritsch, von Rundstedt protested and retired in disgust. His retirement was short. On the eve of war in 1939, Hitler needed experienced commanders. He recalled von Rundstedt and gave him command of Army Group South for the invasion of Poland in September 1939. Von Rundstedt's conduct of the Polish campaign was a textbook execution of combined arms warfare. His troops drove east from Silesia and Moravia, encircling the Polish army and delivering Germany's main blow. Within 35 days, Poland surrendered and the nation ceased to exist. The swift victory, along with those of General Heinz Guderian and others, convinced the Nazi leadership that their new doctrine of fast armored thrusts had revolutionized warfare. In May 1940, von Rundstedt commanded Army Group A in the invasion of France. He supported his chief of staff Erich von Manstein's plan for an armored drive through the thickly forested Ardennes, a sector the French considered impassable for tanks. Von Rundstedt's panzers broke through, encircled the bulk of the Allied armies, and reached the English Channel. This maneuver forced the British Expeditionary Force to evacuate at Dunkirk and led to France's surrender within 6 weeks. It was the greatest German military triumph since 1871. In June 1941, von Rundstedt led Army Group South in Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. His forces swept through Ukraine, capturing Kiev and encircling more than 450,000 Soviet troops. By November 1941, they had taken Rostov. But at that point, von Rundstedt's doubts surfaced. The Russian winter was closing in, supply lines were stretched, and the Red Army was not collapsing as quickly as Hitler had predicted. When Soviet forces counterattacked, von Rundstedt ordered a withdrawal from Rostov. Hitler, who had forbidden any retreats, dismissed him. It was the first time the Field Marshal learned that speaking unpleasant truths could end a career under the Nazi regime. Germany could not afford to waste experienced commanders. In March 1942, Hitler brought von Rundstedt back and appointed him Commander-in-Chief West, Oberbefehlshaber West, OB West. His task was to prepare the defenses along nearly 3,000 miles of coastline from Norway to the Spanish border against an inevitable Allied invasion. On paper, he commanded dozens of divisions. In reality, many were under strength or composed of older conscripts, convalescents, or Osttruppen, soldiers from occupied territories whose loyalty was uncertain. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Western Europe. The Kriegsmarine had lost the Battle of the Atlantic, rendering U-boats ineffective against the massive convoys bringing men and materiel from the United States. You must defend everywhere against an enemy who can choose to land anywhere, von Rundstedt noted, but Germany didn't have enough men, tanks, or aircraft to accomplish this. Two strategic questions dominated OB West in 1943-44. Where will the Allies land? And how should German armor be used to stop them? Von Rundstedt argued from the experience of classic military doctrine. Because forces were limited, he wanted to hold the panzer divisions as a mobile reserve 100 kilometers inland. Once the enemy revealed his point of attack, these divisions could be concentrated for a decisive counterstrike. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, newly appointed to command Army Group B, disagreed. Having seen Allied air power in North Africa and the devastation of German supply convoys, Rommel believed that if Allied troops established a firm foothold, German armor would never reach the beaches. Fighter bombers would destroy tanks on the march. Naval gunfire would smash any counterattack. Rommel insisted that every available tank and gun should be placed as close to the waterline as possible, prepared to hurl the invaders back in the first hours. The first 24 hours will decide everything, he told his staff. It would be, he said, the longest day. Caught between his two most experienced field marshals, Hitler chose not to choose. He personally retained control of key armored units such as the Panzer Lehr Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, meaning these formations could not move without his explicit approval. The compromise was the worst possible outcome, a command system that placed decisive forces under a leader hundreds of miles from the front who could not see what was happening. D-Day began in the early hours of 6th June 1944. Shortly after midnight, 23,400 Allied airborne troops, 13,000 American paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, and thousands of British and Canadian paratroopers and glider infantry jumped behind the German lines from 822 aircraft and gliders. Their mission was to seize key bridges and road junctions, sow confusion, and prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast. At dawn, an armada of over 7,000 naval vessels, including 4,000 landing craft and 1,200 warships, delivered nearly 160,000 Allied troops to 5 beaches along a 50-mile front. More than 12,000 aircraft provided air cover and close support. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history. The landings met varied resistance. At Utah Beach, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division came ashore on relatively lightly defended sands and incurred modest casualties. At Omaha Beach, however, 2 U.S. divisions, 1st and 29th, ran into the seasoned troops of the German 352nd Infantry Division. Machine guns, artillery, and mined obstacles turned the beach into a killing ground. According to the National World War II Museum, the Allies suffered over 10,300 casualties on D-Day, with approximately 2,400 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing at Omaha alone. The German losses there were also heavy, but exact figures are uncertain. By the end of the day, the Allies had landed 34,000 Americans at Omaha, and over 850,000 troops would come ashore in Normandy by the end of June. In the Allied sectors to the east, British and Canadian forces fought to reach Caen, a city whose road network controlled access into the French interior. Operation Epsom, launched on 26 June, sought to outflank the city, but bogged down in hedgerows and mud. Despite heavy casualties on both sides, it forced Rommel and von Rundstedt to commit nearly all their available reserves just to hold the line. It became clear to them that the Allies could not be pushed back into the sea. In a meeting with Hitler after Epsom, both field marshals recommended a strategic withdrawal behind the Seine River. Hitler refused. Von Rundstedt understood that modern war is won or lost on logistics as much as on tactics. The deep water port of Cherbourg on the Cotentin Peninsula was therefore crucial. The city fell to American troops on 26 June. Although the Germans had destroyed harbor installations, Allied engineers quickly restored operations. By late October 1944, the port's discharge rate averaged 13,000 to 14,000 tons of cargo per day, improving to 14,600 to 15,600 tons per day in early November. This throughput, while below the original goal of 24,000 tons, nonetheless allowed the Allies to unload hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies. The ability to bring in fuel, ammunition, food, and reinforcements at an industrial scale meant time was working against Germany. Each day, the beach beachheads were open, Allied strength in men and material increased. Conversely, the German logistical situation was disintegrating. Replacements for lost soldiers were scarce. Many divisions in France were built around older conscripts or foreign volunteers of questionable reliability. Allied air supremacy meant rail yards and road junctions were continually attacked. The German field commanders watched as their reserves dwindled and their ability to counterattack shrank. On D-Day morning, as airborne reports and frantic messages came in, von Rundstedt immediately requested release of the Panzerlehr and 12th SS Panzer divisions to counterattack the beachheads. Because Hitler retained direct control, the request went to the Berghof in Bavaria, where Hitler had been up late watching newsreels. His staff were afraid to wake him. Several hours passed before he gave approval. By then, Allied forces were digging in, clearing minefields and building improvised roadways through the beach exits. When the Panzerlehr and 12th SS finally moved, Allied fighter bombers repeatedly struck the columns. The fear Rommel had voiced came true. German armor was attrited on the approach roads and arrived piecemeal in the battle area. The command structure thus created a cascading delay. Von Rundstedt could see the battle unfolding. He knew each hour was critical, but because authority to move key divisions rested with Hitler, he was reduced to sending requests and waiting for replies. In modern organizational terms, the decision-making process was misaligned with the operational tempo. The man furthest from the fighting had the final say. As a result, the opportunity for a swift and coordinated counterattack evaporated. After the initial landings, the Allied advance slowed. The Norman countryside, hedgerows, sunken lanes, and small fields favored the defender. Each field was a fortress. The Germans' 352nd and 716th Divisions, as well as elements of the 21st Panzer Division, fought tenaciously. Yet the battle became a grinding contest the Germans could not sustain. Allied troops enjoyed complete air cover, access to naval gunfire, and endless streams of supplies. German units had no reserves and could not replace lost tanks or guns. For von Rundstedt and Rommel, each passing day confirmed that strategic withdrawal was the only rational option. Their repeated pleas to reposition behind the Seine were ignored. By late June, the situation had deteriorated further. The failed counterattack at Caen on 1st July convinced von Rundstedt that pushing the Allies back into the sea was impossible. When Keitel called to ask what the Oberkommando should do, the old field marshal answered, as a professional soldier rather than a party member, "Make peace, you fools. What else can you do?" In this context, the word fools carried the weight of decades of military service. He was not insulting his fellow officers so much as indicting the political leadership that refused to see reality. The reaction was swift. Hitler removed von Rundstedt the next day and replaced him with Field Marshal Günther von Kluge. Von Rundstedt retreated to his estate. In a regime that prized obedience over competence, he had committed an unpardonable sin. He had told the truth, and yet he was not done with the war. On 20th July 1944, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb planted at his East Prussian headquarters. The plot failed. In the ensuing purge, the Gestapo arrested more than 7,000 people, and 4,080 were executed, often on the barest evidence. Von Rundstedt was not involved in the conspiracy, but his earlier criticisms of Hitler meant he was viewed with suspicion. Ironically, the Führer asked him to preside over the military court of honor that expelled officers implicated in the plot. Von Rundstedt used the position to save some officers by limiting charges to lesser infractions, but many more were handed over to the Volksgerichtshof, People's Court, where Judge Roland Freisler sentenced them to death. The purge further depleted the professionalism of the German officer corps, removing experienced leaders at a time when Germany could least afford it. The strategic withdrawal von Rundstedt had advocated soon became a forced retreat. In July and August 1944, as the Allies broke out from Normandy, they encircled large elements of Army Group B in the Falaise pocket. The Imperial War Museums note that around 50,000 German soldiers escaped eastward, but another 60,000 were either killed or captured by 22 August. General Dwight Eisenhower described the carnage as a scene that could be described only by Dante, because so many corpses littered the fields. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the Germans had suffered close to 300,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured, while Allied losses were just over 200,000. The path to Paris was open. In the east, a concurrent Soviet offensive, Operation Bagration, destroyed Army Group Center, capturing or killing more than 300,000 German troops. The Red Army advanced hundreds of miles. Germany found itself fighting major offensives on two fronts with a depleted and demoralized army. Yet Hitler still demanded attacks. Von Rundstedt was recalled yet again on 3 September 1944 to command OB West. he was expected to stem the Allied advance with shattered divisions. In mid-September, he opposed Operation Market Garden, the Allied airborne plan to seize bridges over the Rhine. Although Market Garden failed, it was not due to any German masterstroke but to Allied overreach and luck. Von Rundstedt's forces were simply positioned on the flanks of the corridor and able to compress it. When Field Marshal Walter Model took over Army Group B, von Rundstedt oversaw the defense but lacked the resources to mount significant counterattacks. In December 1944, Hitler unveiled Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Von Rundstedt opposed the plan. He argued that Germany lacked the troops, fuel, and air cover to execute a large offensive in the West. German forces numbered perhaps 30 divisions, including many understrength units, while the Allies had more than 70 divisions in theater. The offensive required ideal weather, fog-to-ground Allied aircraft, and complete surprise. Nevertheless, Hitler insisted on attacking through the Ardennes, the same ground the Germans had used successfully in 1940 toward the port of Antwerp. The plan ignored the fact that Allied air power, once the weather cleared, could batter German movements and that Allied logistics dwarfed Germany's. Von Rundstedt dutifully signed the orders, but told his staff he expected failure. The offensive achieved tactical surprise on 16 December 1944 and initially threw the Americans into confusion. But within days, Allied resistance stiffened. Once the weather improved, 14,000 Allied aircraft attacked German columns. By early January, the salient collapsed. Unternehmen Nordwind, a follow-on offensive aimed at Strasbourg and the Vosges, also failed. In March 1945, von Rundstedt again advised Hitler to seek peace and was removed from command on 11th March. On 1st May 1945, soldiers of the U.S. 36th Infantry Division arrested von Rundstedt. During interrogation, he suffered a heart attack, not his first, and was evacuated to Britain for treatment. The British considered charging him with war crimes for supporting the harsh severity order on the Eastern Front, but his age and poor health spared him. He was released from custody in July 1948 and lived quietly near Hanover until his death on 24 February 1953. He never faced trial and never expressed remorse for his role in Germany's campaigns. To the end, he saw himself as a soldier who had served his country, not a politician. Von Rundstedt's career illustrates how professional competence and institutional loyalty can collide with political fanaticism. His mastery of operational art produced early victories, but his failure to challenge the regime's moral foundations prevented him from changing Germany's course. When he finally spoke the truth, "Make peace, you fools," he was dismissed because the system punished candor. The phrase encapsulates a timeless tension. Those closest to a problem often understand it best, but those farthest from the ground often hold the power to ignore them. Several themes emerge. Command and control must match operational tempo. The D-Day crisis showed that a centralized system in which critical units required authorization from a distant leader is fatally slow. Hitler's insistence on personally releasing panzer divisions delayed counterattacks at a moment when hours mattered. Modern organizations, military, corporate, or governmental, must empower those on the front lines to make timely decisions. Honesty must be valued over flattery. Von Rundstedt's career demonstrates that ignoring uncomfortable truths can be catastrophic. Leaders who surround themselves with people who tell them only what they wish to hear are vulnerable to self-inflicted disasters. The purge following the July 20th plot removed some of the German army's most capable officers at the moment when strategic truth-telling was essential. Logistics and industrial capacity determine strategic outcomes. Germany lost the Battle of Normandy, not because its soldiers fought poorly, but because the Allies could bring in more men, fuel, and ammunition than the Germans could destroy. Cherbourg's restored port unloaded 15,600 tons per day. Allied convoys delivered thousands of vehicles. In contrast, Germany's war economy, battered by Allied bombing and blockaded by sea, could not replace losses. For modern organizations, this underscores the importance of supply chains and resource management. Cultural inertia can override professional judgment. Von Rundstedt's deference to duty meant he never contemplated resigning in protest when Germany launched aggressive wars. He participated in campaigns that resulted in immense suffering, including the encirclements in Ukraine that killed or captured hundreds of thousands. His eventual objections were tactical, not ethical. This highlights the peril of professional cultures that prioritize obedience over moral reflection. In early July 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt told his superiors a truth they did not wish to hear: Germany could not win the war. The decision to punish him rather than heed his advice contributed to 10 more months of needless slaughter. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin would burn. Millions more soldiers and civilians would die. The Soviet army would exact a terrible revenge for the atrocities committed in the East. When von Rundstedt looked out over the ruins in 1945, he had to acknowledge, at least privately, that he had predicted this outcome. Yet he had also participated in making it possible. The moral of von Rundstedt's story is not simply that honesty is punished under dictatorships. It is that in any hierarchical organization, there is an ever-present temptation for leaders to shield themselves from bad news, to confuse loyalty with silence, and to centralize decisions they are not equipped to make. The German High Command's dysfunction on D-Day, its refusal to adapt strategy, and its purge of dissenting voices offer stark warnings. In our own time, whether in business, government, or the military, leaders face complex problems that can only be solved by listening to those who understand the details. When the people who see the problem are afraid to speak, or when those at the top dismiss unwelcome information, failure follows. Von Rundstedt's fate reminds us that truth-telling is not just a virtue, it is a strategic necessity.